Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel and welcome if you are new. My name is Amber and today I am going to actually continue on my Haunted Canada series. I had decided when I first started this channel that I wanted to really showcase hauntings in Canada that are maybe not so popularly known, but also widely known, and just kind of go through them, talk about the things that they could mean, and yeah, just kind of show the rest of the world all of our most popular places. And it also kind of got solidified for me because this past Halloween, I actually bought a magazine that was like Haunted Places of the World, and I think there were 2 places from Canada in there. Everything else was the States for North America, and then everywhere else in the world. And trust me, we have way more than 2 places in Canada that are widely known for their hauntings. So, that being said, I started with the Fortress of Louisbourg last week, and this time around, I am going to be doing the Great Amherst Mystery. Now, for those of you who don't know, we're kind of staying in Nova Scotia, which was actually kind of just a coincidence for this story. I had actually just decided I was going to do one of my favorite stories that I remember reading as a child, and it just happened to be in Nova Scotia as well. So this mystery, which is probably the best way to put it, happened in Amherst, Nova Scotia back in 1878. And it happened for a full year, so from 1878 to 1879. And there are many theories as to what it was and why this is happening and why this girl was actually targeted in particular. And there's a lot of speculation, which is sometimes a good thing and also sometimes a bad thing, because then sometimes the truth gets ignored because people just don't want to believe that it might actually be something unexplainable. So, I first heard about this story when I picked up this book at a Scholastic book fair. Now, anybody from Canada knows how exciting Scholastic book fairs are, and like you hunted for books that you really liked. And every Halloween, they always came out with like the creepy stories and everything else. And this was one of my favorites that I picked up. I actually own the entire series. But it's called Haunted Canada, and it's a series of true stories throughout Canada of hauntings that have taken place. Now, this one has a ton. It was done in 2003, and it's a short book. Most of the stories are only a couple of pages long, but it's a good read, and it kind of gets you learning more about your history. So I was going through this book when I first bought it and was really happy with my new purchase and whatever. And I got partway through, and there's this story called Possession, and it's located in Amherst, Nova Scotia. And I went, this is cool, because all the other ones are just kind of like, ooh, the ghost walks around and, you know, scares people, and or you can hear weird noises, or you see weird things. There was nothing prior to this story in the book that was particularly dark. And for a kid's book, I've actually found this one fairly dark, and it kind of made me excited. I don't know if that sounds terrible, but it did. So this story is called, well, they dubbed it the Great Amherst Mystery. So to kind of rewind and give you a little bit of history on the house. So for the purpose of this, I am just going to read you the story out of this book that I first fell in love with. And then I do actually have another book that is my roommate's, and you can see why I love all of this creepy stuff, and why she feeds into it so perfectly once I bring that book out. So this story is called Possession, and it's set in Amherst, Nova Scotia. Sometimes a ghost haunts a person, not a place. Wherever that person goes, spooky things happen. Ghost experts usually blame this type of haunting on a particular kind of ghost, a poltergeist. They hide things, make scary noises, and send stuff flying around a room. They don't hang around forever, and they often pester a younger person. That description matches what happened to Esther Cox, but only up until a point. The poltergeist that targeted her didn't just pester her. For nearly a year, starting in September 1878, it made her life a living hell. Cox was 18 when the nightmare began. At the time, she was living in the home of her married sister Olive and Olive's husband Daniel Teed. Her brother William and another sister Jane were also staying in the 2-story wooden house in Amherst. So were Daniel and Olive's young children, and Daniel's brother John. Esther and Jane shared a bedroom in the cozy but crowded house. One night in early September, Jane awakened to hear Esther whispering that there were mice in their bed. At first, Jane thought her sister was just imagining things. Then she heard the scratching too. When both sisters jumped out of bed, they realized the sounds were coming from under the bed, not in it. They pulled out a low cardboard box of quilt patches, figuring that little rodents were building a nest in it. But as soon as they dragged the box into the middle of the room, it seemed to take on a life of its own. It shot up in the air, then tipped over on its side. A few seconds later, it took off and fell down again. Their sisters screamed for help. Their brother-in-law Daniel rushed in to see what was wrong. But when he heard what had happened, he said they must have been dreaming and told them to go back to bed. The next night, though all the adults in the house came running into the bedroom when Jane screamed for help, what they found nearly turned their stomachs. As Esther screamed and writhed in pain on the bed, she began to swell up like a bloated corpse. Loud raps and snapping sounds filled the air, many of them coming from under the bed. Suddenly, after one ear-splitting bang, Esther's body deflated, and the wretched young woman fell into a deep sleep. Ow! When a similar scene played out again 4 nights later, Esther's family asked the doctor to pay a visit. After listening to what he thought was a lot of nonsense, he told them that Esther was just suffering from a bad case of nerves. But right after he stated his diagnosis, Esther's pillow started to move back and forth, and her blankets flew off the bed and across the room. The loud noises started again, but they weren't nearly as frightening as a new, softer scratching sound that made everyone look above the bed. There, over the headboard, words began to emerge. The message, written by the unforeseen force, was chilling. Esther Cox, it read, "You are mine to kill." Fear filled the house from then on, and with good reason. The unnatural activities extended beyond Esther's bedroom. Something hammered on the roof and hurled potatoes around the basement. The knocking sounds took on a strange pattern and seemed to be in an attempt at communication. It appeared that whatever was haunting the house was able to hear and see what was going on. When asked questions such as, "How many people are in the room?" it answered with the correct number of knocks. In December 1878, Esther became very ill. She spent 2 weeks in bed fighting diphtheria. Esther's family took very good care of her, but they couldn't help but notice her illness had brought some blessed relief. Not once during those 2 weeks did anything unusual happen in the house. When Esther was well enough to travel, she went to stay for a few weeks with another married sister in Sackville, New Brunswick, giving the Amherst household another welcome break from the horror. But shortly after Esther returned home in early January, things got worse. Along with the noises and moving objects, lit matches would appear out of thin air just below the ceiling and, still burning, dropped to the floor. The danger of fire became very real, especially when Esther heard a voice telling her that the house was going to burn down. For the sake of her family, Esther had to go. Esther's journey over the next several months was a lonely search for peace. Even going to church didn't bring her comfort. She had to stop attending regular Sunday services because the banging and hammering followed her there, disturbing others and leaving her humiliated. The Whites, a farming couple who needed extra help, took her in, but as much as they appreciated how hard she worked, they couldn't deal with the disappearing tools and flying objects. In March of 1879, Captain James Beck played host to Esther in St. John, New Brunswick. Hoping to learn more about what was happening to her, he invited a group of people interested in after-death connections to meet Esther and ask the haunting spirit some questions. They concluded that several ghosts were haunting Esther. Another man, Walter Hubble, reached a similar conclusion. Hubble was an American actor who happened to be touring the Maritimes in 1879. Like so many others who had read the newspaper accounts of Esther's nightmare, Hubble wanted to see for himself what was happening in Amherst. In June, not long after Esther had moved back home, Hubble showed up at the family's house and was shocked by what he witnessed over the next several weeks. Later, he would write a short book, The Haunted House, in which he told of a flying umbrella, a whizzing carving knife, chairs that broke on their own, and perhaps most disturbing of all, hundreds of pins that jabbed themselves into Esther's tormented body. Hubble also reported spending time with Esther when, in a trance-like state, she talked about and even named the many invisible spirits that surrounded her. At one point, Hubble tried to turn Esther's plight into a money-making enterprise. He planned on touring with her, presenting her story as one would a play, but after just one appearance before a disappointed audience, he realized that Esther's ghosts wouldn't make themselves known on demand, something he had hoped would draw big crowds. Hubble left town soon afterward, but his money-making efforts weren't entirely in vain. His book about what came to be known as the Great Amherst Mystery turned out to be a bestseller. After Hubble left, Esther managed to get a job working for an Amherst farmer named Arthur Davison. Like the Whites, the Davisons were willing to put up with a few flying objects and strange sounds, but not unexplained fires. When the Davisons' barn burned down, he blamed Esther. She was charged with arson, found guilty, and sentenced to 4 months in jail. However, local townsfolk felt sorry for her and convinced authorities to release her after just 1 month. Thankfully, by the end of 1879, the spirits that haunted Esther finally left her in peace. Eventually, she married a man from Springdale, Nova Scotia, and had a little boy. When her first husband died, she remarried, moved to Massachusetts, and had another son. She died in November 1912 at the age of 52. Several years later, the cottage where the horror began for her was torn down to make way for new shops in downtown Amherst. But Esther Cox's spirit lives on, and the Great Amherst Mystery was written up in books and articles that were published around the world, and her nightmarish experience is still considered one of the most famous ghost stories on record. So that was the one that I grew up reading, and it made me really excited. I think I actually begged my mom at one point if we could go to Amherst so that I could see the area that all of this was happening in, even though I knew that the building had been torn down at that point. So when I had mentioned to my roommate that I was actually going to be doing this story, she said, "Oh, well, one of the books that sits behind you, it's probably in there." And I was like, yeah, okay, sure. So she has this book called The Encyclopedia of Ghosts and Spirits. And so I was like, okay, yeah, I'll open it. I'll see what's in here. And I opened it up, and sure enough, right before Amityville is the Amherst haunting. Now, most of what's in here is pretty much everything that I read in that story. There's not a lot of difference Although this one actually has the name of one of the spirits that they figure was haunting her, and they apparently said that he called himself Bob. He apparently left more than just one message written on the wall, so it wasn't just the Esther Cox, you are mine to kill message. Apparently, with how many things kept happening, it actually got to a point where people were so, I guess, enthralled in what was going on that they used to like gather outside the house and watch as if it was a spectacle, and the police actually ended up being called to come and break up the crowd of people standing outside the house. Now, it basically just goes on to talk about all the same stories in there. Apparently, they do name the doctor here as Dr. Carriot, and when he came in and did the examination of her and actually diagnosed her as just, suffering from nerves and everything, and they were talking about how everything started to happen. Apparently, it also says here that while he was examining her, the bolster beneath her head rose up violently, hit him on the head before returning to its former spot. The astonished doctor took a few moments to restore his equilibrium and sat down in a chair. He heard a metallic scratching sound coming from the wall behind him. Turning to see its source, he saw written upon the wall, "Esther Cox, you are mine to kill." At the same time, the doctor heard peals of thunder and saw a piece of plaster fall from the ceiling and swirl around the room. To the terrified Dr. Carriot's credit, he returned the next day to examine his patient. As he was bending over Esther, he was hit with a barrage of potatoes, which sent him flying across the room. Nevertheless, the doctor continued in his ministrations by giving her a sedative. I love how that's the solution. Oh, all of these things are happening to me. I'm just going to sedate the patient and hope for the best. Cool. Apparently, the next day, Esther complained of feeling as though electricity was passing through her body, so he administered more sedatives that evening and put her to bed. Loud raps as though someone was pounding on the roof of the house continued. Dr. Carriot went outside, where strong moonlight enabled him to see that nobody was on the roof. Yet, when returned inside, the family said that while he had been out, it sounded as though someone were pounding on the roof with a sledgehammer. The poundings repeated intermittently, but eventually they were on all day long and were heard by passers-by. The noises were written up in the local Gazette newspaper and other papers throughout Canada. Then it just goes on to talk about how eventually they had a Baptist clergyman come to the house, and it basically says here that after he began to visit frequently, he agreed with the doctor that she was not producing the noises herself, and his opinion was that her nerves had received some sort of electric shock, thus turning her into a living battery. What is left in the rest of this book is actually a lot more detail than what was in the other one, so I'm just going to read basically what the rest of this says because it gives you a little bit more insight into what was going on with her at the peak of everybody being really worried. So it says, this theory provided to be a popular one, and Reverend Clay began to give numerous lectures on it, always defending Esther against any accusations of fraud. The publicity caused throngs of people to gather outside the Teed cottage daily. Reverend Clay quit visiting Esther when she contracted diphtheria months later. When she recovered, she left the Teed home to stay temporarily with a married sister in New Brunswick, which we heard from the first one. It says, then when Esther returned home, so did the spirit, even with a greater desire for destruction and disruption. One night Esther told Jenny that she could hear a voice saying that it would burn the house down. The voice also stated that it had once lived on Earth, had died, and was now only a ghost. The girls called in family members to relay the message, and while all were laughing at the preposterousness of such a thing happening, lighted matches began falling from the ceiling onto Esther's bed. Communication with the spirit was then initiated, and when asked if it would really set the house on fire, it answered in the affirmative. As apparent proof, one of Esther's dresses hanging on a nail on the wall was rolled up by invisible hands, stuffed beneath the bed, and lighted a fire. Daniel Teed pulled the dress out and snuffed the fire before it could do any serious damage. Bob set Olive Teed's skirts on fire and allegedly set several small fires in different parts of the house, which again caused more fright than damage. During one fire, emanating from a bucket of cedar shavings in the basement, Esther ran into the street screaming for help, and neighbors came to her aid. The local fire department, however, suspected arson, perhaps by Esther. However, she was within view of Olive when the fire started and could not have been responsible. It really bugs me that everybody was so against it at that time that they were like, oh, she's just doing this because she's a moody, angsty teenager. Why would you set your house on fire? You're already going through enough. Like, you've proven that this isn't going to get rid of it yet. So you really think setting the house on fire is going to do something? Probably not. It then says that members of the public suggested that Esther should be flogged in order to beat the evil out of her. What? Instead, Daniel Teed sent her to the house of Mr. White for safety, but the spirit apparently was having too much fun and continued setting fires in her absence. So not only did she get sent away and the spirit was tormenting the people she was sent to live with, it was still setting fires at the house that she was actually supposed to be living in. Something tells me this thing is a little smarter than they gave it credit for. Around this time is when Walter Hubble, an actor in the strolling company based in Amherst, became interested in the case as a possible moneymaker, which we also covered in the other story. It says, his efforts were rewarded by assaults upon him by his umbrella and a large carving knife that flew briskly through the air in his direction. Being young and nimble, he was able to duck in time, only to see a huge armchair coming across the room toward him. Hoping to put an end to the family's torment, the local clergyman, Reverend R.A. Temple, held a meeting of prayer and exorcism in the house. When the Reverend asked the spirit to speak, it responded with loud trumpet playing. The Reverend fled the house, but the spirit became enamored of its own playing and continued to blast on the instrument. The musical finale was accompanied by a display of lighted matches. This thing sounds really destructive. Mischief continued to plague other members of the household. George Cox, Esther's brother, was humiliated when he mysteriously was undressed 3 times in public. What? 3 times in public? One day, Walter Hubble observed that the cat was the only resident that had not been tormented. The cat instantly was levitated about 5 feet into the air and set down on Esther's shoulders. The terrified animal ran out of the house where it remained for the rest of the day. No kidding. The fire starting also continued. Hubble, who in 1888 wrote his account of the case, The Great Amherst Mystery, described his first encounter with the spirit's fire tricks. I say, candidly, that until I had that experience, I never fully realized what an awful calamity it was to have an invisible monster somewhere within the atmosphere, gathering up old newspapers into a bundle and hiding it in a basket of soiled linen or in a closet, and then go and steal matches out of the matchbox in the kitchen or somebody's pocket, as he did out of mine. And after kindling a fire in the bundle, tell Esther that he had started a fire, but would not tell her where, or perhaps not tell her at all. In which case, the first intimation we would have was the smell of smoke pouring through the house and the most intense excitement, everybody running with buckets of water. I say it was the most truly awful calamity that could possibly befall any family, infidel or Christian. that could be conceived in the mind of man or ghost, and how much more terrible did it seem in this little cottage, where we were all strict members of the church, prayed, sang hymns, and read the Bible. Poor Mrs. Teed. Basically, it goes on to talk about how the landlord finally became really stressed out that there was going to be way too much damage caused to his property, and asked that Esther leave in order to hopefully fix the problem, and everything returned to normal. She was then harassed once more from this spirit that they had dubbed Bob, where he actually, like they said in the other story, had set the barn on fire of the place that she lived. Now, it does end happily, like we had mentioned before, but it's basically come down to they think that she had an unwitting focus of psychokinetic energy which caused the phenomena due to repressed emotions. She was within the age range of common poltergeist disturbances believed to be caused by human agents. She may have suffered repressed hostility and tension, perhaps from living in very close quarters with a large family, and may have also suffered repressed sexual feelings. The fact that the disturbance stopped first when she left the crowded Teed household for temporary stays elsewhere, and finally to marry and have her own household, support this explanation. Basically, they're chalking it up to the fact that just because she was a stressed out teenager, all of this was happening to her. But I think there's just potentially something a little more. I'm not really sure. I'd love to hear your guys' opinions on it. So if you have something that you would like to add to this story or any theories about what was actually going on, please leave them down in the comments. Please like this video if you enjoyed what you heard. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notifications because I upload a video every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for your pleasure. I think that's all for me tonight, so I'll see you guys later. Bye.